All right, so we're officially at noon or thereabouts. I want to make sure we try to stay on time for everybody that's joining us today. So we'll get this going. This is going to be recorded, so if anybody is a couple minutes late, that's okay. They'll be able to watch this back from the beginning. But Bill, why don't you get us started if you would?
Great. Thank you very much, Will. I'm Bill Campbell with Campbell Property Management. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this virtual CEU course on the fundamentals of reserves. It is a pleasure to be working with Will Simons from Association Reserves. We've been working with Will for many years and does a great job. So thank you very much, Will. For those of you who don't know Campbell, we manage around 400 communities. We have over 850 full-time employees, including 150 managers. I see a lot of Campbell managers out there. It's great to see you. Also, we want to thank our guests for joining us. It's great. I hope you enjoy this. I know it'll be informative to everybody. And we try to do these types of things for the community and for the management industry. And we try to make it convenient for you because we know as managers how busy it can be. So hopefully by having this virtual, it'll be the first of many. And we appreciate any feedback you can provide us so that we can help you out in the future. So with that, Will, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate your time here and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. Yeah, strange times doing these in the days of COVID. You know, we used to do all these in live formats for different organizations, and you know, it's better than nothing. But I wish I could see all your faces out there. But I do want to thank you for joining us. I'm going to say hello on camera here for just another moment or two. I'm going to turn off my camera during the class itself, just so you can focus more on the slides. We've got a lot of great content to cover. Just another quick announcement before we get going. I'm going to be doing another class next week. Actually, it's going to be on Tuesday the 11th. That's also going to start at noon. I think that's going to be a great follow-up to the material we'll cover today. I'm going to cover certain topics in more detail, particularly the subject of pooled reserves versus straight line reserves. That is one of the most misunderstood and important topics that we come across in our industry, so I want to make sure that and we spent a good amount of time on that. Some of you had already submitted some great questions on that subject. And I guess the best thing I can say is tune in next week. We're going to have a lot of better discussion in more detail on that. Today's class should run about 50 minutes or so. I'll have a list of questions that I'll run through at the end. Again, got a lot of great questions ahead of time. I'll tell you folks right now, there were so many questions that there's probably no way I'll get through all of them. So I just wanted to say that up front. I do appreciate the information, but if I don't happen to get to your question during the material today or during this session, feel free to send me an email or give me a call after the fact. I'll be happy to discuss. Some of the questions you gave were kind of unique situations that might require a little bit more background information. But what I tried to do was go through the list and combine as many questions as I could that would be good to discuss kind of with the larger group. So again, that second class will be on the 11th. We'll have more time to get through more questions then. So if you haven't gotten the email link, the invitation to next week's class, be on the lookout for that. I'm sure Campbell will be sending those out very soon. One last thing, just another reminder, this class is being recorded, so don't feel that you've got to be scrambling to take notes the whole time. You will get a chance to watch it over again. And feel free to share that video as well. It's going to be a YouTube link that you can share with anybody you like. So if you're a board member and some of your fellow board members couldn't make it today, feel free to pass that on. If you're a manager and you think you have a board or some colleagues that might benefit from this, share that far and wide. That's why we're here. So last bit of housekeeping for the managers out there, we will be submitting your credits to the DBPR as soon as possible after the class. You're all going to get an hour of credit for today's class. Just as a, I guess, warning or a bit of notice ahead of time, the last few times we've done this, they've been very slow to respond in posting those credits. So I don't know what the situation is there, if they're just kind of short-staffed due to COVID or what the deal is, but just bear with us. You know, appreciate your patience. That seems to be taking longer than normal. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and switch off my camera and we will get this started. So we'll do that now. Thank you. Okay, here we go. All right, so again, thank you for joining us today. This class is called Fundamentals of Reserves. The class is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the insurance and financial management section or as an elective. For you managers out there, if you haven't already provided us with your first name, last name, and CAM license number, please be sure to do so. I know I asked a bunch of you to send me an email about a week or so ago with your CAM license numbers, so thank you very much for doing that. If you weren't asked to provide that when you registered for the course, please feel free to go ahead and send that by email. If you did submit it with the registration, then you're all good. That was just an error on our part. We didn't have that as a requirement in the beginning. With that said, I don't want to give the impression that this course is only for managers, right? So in fact, I think the majority of our group today are board members, committee members, residents. I hope you're all going to learn a great deal about reserve budgeting and planning and come away better prepared to lead and serve your communities. If anybody's interested in getting a copy of the actual slides for today's presentation, I'm happy to send those out as well, so please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to just introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. My name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008. I've spent most of my career in Florida. We've had clients in Florida going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist, which is an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their expertise and experience in preparing reserve studies. The designation itself comes from the Community Associations Institute, CAI. There's only been a few hundred people to ever earn that credential over the last 20 plus years or so. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida, where I oversaw a budget of over $1 million. And the reason I like to point that out is because I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, right? I've worked with the volunteers, the committees who are taking on the responsibility of managing their communities, which we know can represent hundreds of people and many millions of dollars worth of property value. So for you board members out there, I know how it is. I know it's a thankless job, but I commend you for doing the right thing and trying to be responsible on behalf of your owners there. Just a bit about the company, who's Association Reserves. We're basically the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in this business since 1986. We've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast. We have more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, including all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other residential communities. But we also have a great deal of experience with other property types, such as office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, and many others. One thing I always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we're not an engineering firm, we're not an accounting firm, rather we're a specialized consulting firm that is focused on doing one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So if we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them to design, hopefully they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other types of financial distress. If you'd like any other information about our company, please visit our website, and that's reservestudy.com. And if you'd like, you can shoot me an email anytime. I'm going to have this on the slide at the end of the class too, but my email address is wsimons, that's WSIMONS @reservestudy.com. Okay, so folks, this is what we're going to cover today. The course really just has 2 sections. We'll spend a little bit of time in the beginning answering this basic question: what are reserves? And then we'll spend the majority of the class talking about reserve studies and how those documents are used by community associations to make sure they're on the right track with regard to long-term planning. Along the way, we're going to break it up a little bit. We'll take a look at some communities that we're not adequately funding. The reason I do that is so you can see some real-world examples of what can happen when reserves are ignored. So Again, feel free to take notes as you go along. We will have the recording to send to you later on, but let's get this started. So I include this slide here in every presentation that I give because I think it illustrates a very common reaction or mindset when it comes to long-term planning. Okay, so what we see out there and what I'm sure some of you have seen amongst your communities is this reluctance to embrace the responsibility of long-term planning, right? I think this guy here basically represents a attitude that we see a lot when it comes to thinking about reserves. If you look at him, he's got his eyes closed, fingers crossed, kind of a pained look on his face. So if there's one message that I'd like you all to remember from today's class, it's that we all need to go out there to the communities that we work with and help them get over and get around this mindset, right? It's our responsibility, whether you're a volunteer or a professional in this field, to educate the people around us, not let excuses get in the way, and to do your best to help the people that we serve to help themselves. All right, so this first basic question out there, what are reserves? Okay. For those that have been in this field for a while, or if you've been on a board before, this is going to be fairly elementary, but for those who might be newer to this process, I think we'll just spend a couple minutes talking about the two main aspects of any given association's budget. Basically, the budget can be categorized into two sections. You've got your operating fund and your reserve fund or funds. We'll talk first about the operating fund. So basically, your operating money is there for your routine costs of running the business of the community association. Okay, these are going to be your daily, weekly, monthly types of expenses for things like utilities, insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, and so on. If you want to think of this in personal terms, sometimes I describe the operating account sort of like your own personal checking account, right? Operating funds are restricted. That means that you can spend the money in your operating account on any bill that the association has to pay. Typically, that money is going to be spent in the same year that you collect it. So what that means is that if you've designed a very good budget, you shouldn't have any substantial surplus or deficit at the end of the year, and you're going to spend all of the money that you collect within a given fiscal year during that same year. Okay. Now, on the other hand, you've got your reserve account, and those accounts are there for the long-term expenses that the association will have to pay for. Some of those things may not come along for 5, 10, or even 25 years at a time, but when they do occur, those might be some of the biggest bills the association will ever have to pay. Now, your reserve funds are typically going to be used for things like roof replacements, painting buildings, pavement resurfacings, lots of other projects we'll talk about later on. See a couple of the other differences between operating and reserves. Reserve funds are restricted. So what that means is that once you put $1 into a reserve account, it can only be spent on specific things. You cannot spend reserve money on any bill the association has. Another difference, in contrast to the operating account, reserve money will accumulate over time, sometimes over many, many years. The idea there is you're building up an account balance until it needs to be spent for its intended purpose. So going back to our analogy in that way, the reserve account is more like a savings account, might be for an individual. Okay. On this slide here, I've got a short excerpt from the Florida statutes. Specifically, we're looking at a section of Statute 718, which is known as the condo statute. Now, what I've highlighted in red here is the portion of the text that talks about what associations must be reserving for. And if you look at that section, the statute requires that condo associations reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in this one sort of general definition. Okay, the 3 things they name specifically being roofs, painting, and paving, and then the general catch-all definition they have at the end there is for any other item with a replacement cost exceeding $10,000. Okay, now you may be wondering, why did they pick $10,000? And I've been teaching this class for many years. I've asked this question in front of many different audiences. Nobody's ever given me a clear answer as to why the number is $10,000. Okay, why didn't they make it $1,000 or $25,000? As far as I can tell, nobody really knows. My guess is that when they wrote the statute, they picked a number that sounded high and said, let's go with that. Okay. My point is that the $10,000 number is totally arbitrary. Okay, for many associations, that number is probably much too high of a threshold to set. We'll talk about this later in the class, but a more appropriate way to look at that dollar amount should be something like, what is a significantly, a financially significant number rather to my association. Okay, for those of you in the HOAs, this is a section of your statute, 720, which actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in your association. Unlike the condo statute, the HOA statute does not have any specific checklist of items that need to be included. Pretty much all they say here is that, hey, there are certain things that the association is responsible for, and if you don't have reserves, that could result in a special assessment. Okay. Now the good news here is that there's actually a much more realistic and thorough way to go about defining what any association should be including in its reserve planning. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. For now, I just want to have you keep this sort of basic definition in mind. Okay, reserve money is there for an association to save over a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Now it's important to notice what I did not say. Okay, I did not say that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements, on paying a costly insurance deductible, or really for any other purpose. Okay, so as an example, let's say an association does not have a playground, but all of the residents are pretty unanimous that they really want to put in a playground. Okay, that might be a very worthwhile thing to do, but you could not use reserve money for that. In that case, you'd be adding a new element to the association that would have never been considered in any of your prior year's budgets. And so any prior reserve contributions would have never taken that initial construction project into account. So again, in reality, it might be a great thing to do, but the initial expense, the creation of the playground, would have to come out of some other means, right? Maybe an operating fund or a capital fund, something else. Going forward though, once the playground was built, once that's in place, then the association would need to start reserving for it and thinking of long-term replacement cycles for things like equipment and fencing and a fall surface and all that kind of stuff. But that first cost would not be an eligible reserve component. Okay, that brings us to the end of that first section, and a couple of times during this class I'm going to break things up and take you through what I fondly call our Hall of Shame. Okay, every single one of these pictures you're going to see is an example of what can go wrong, specifically when associations are not properly funding their reserves. I've taken most of these photos myself. Some of them were provided by some of our other staff members, but every single one of these is a real life client that we've worked with. The reason I'm including these photos, I'm not trying to make fun of these communities or kick them when they're down. It's basically just a cautionary tale, right? I want to show you what happens when communities are not taking financial responsibility and not thinking about the long-term consequences of their budgeting decisions. One of the key points that I like to make here, and which you'll see recurring in some of these photos, is that reserve funding is not only about fixing what is broken. Okay, a very important concept to keep in mind is the idea that property value can be greatly affected by the aesthetics of the common areas in a community. It's not enough to ask whether something is just functional or not. Instead, you should be asking, are we doing all that we can to try and make this an attractive place to live, not only for our current owners, but for potential buyers as well? All right, so first picture you're looking at here, obviously a pretty nasty looking roof. Distinctly remember walking up on this roof and having to watch my step so that I didn't flood my shoes with a couple inches of standing water. Obviously, this is not what flat roofs are intended to look like. Just think, if you will, about the weight of all that water for a moment. Imagine the weight of all that water pressing down on the roof surface. You know it's only a matter of time before that water will eventually find its way into this building. Okay. This one here is bad for a couple of different reasons. What you're looking at now is called a mansard roof. It's an architectural style where the roof shingles are on the outer perimeter of the building, and they're very steep. It's basically mostly a decorative type architecture. I remember taking this photo and I looked up wondering if I really wanted to get any closer to the building. Okay, this is a 3-story building, as I recall. It's pretty easy to imagine that one of these shingles that you see there in the photo coming loose just right at the moment when somebody's walking underneath it. Again, that could be anybody. That could be the mailman. It could be a landscaper. It could be somebody's grandchild. The point is, not only are these shingles not protecting the building anymore, They also look terrible and probably an accident waiting to happen. Okay, which we've got here, this is a seawall that has obviously failed. Originally, this was a metal sheet pile seawall that at this point is basically turning to dust after a couple of decades of salt water and air exposure. Pretty sure at this point the client was just going to abandon this portion of the property and kind of let it go back to nature. Not much else you could do, I guess. On this one here, I want to give this client some credit for attempting to do the right thing. Unfortunately, it's an example maybe of too little too late, okay? If you look closely, what you'll see is this kind of advanced pattern of deterioration, this cracking in the pavement. We call this alligatoring because it basically looks like an alligator's back, right? By any definition, this pavement has failed, but the additional mistake that the client made here was to just try and simply put new asphalt on top of the old deteriorated surface. To me, this was basically throwing good money after bad, because whatever money they spent on the new layer there was pretty much a total waste. Like I said, I give them points for trying, but you can clearly see that the pattern of cracking that existed there is now just reflecting upward again through the new surface. And it probably didn't take that long, maybe a year or two. Okay. Last one for the time being. This one strikes me as funny because I really don't know how it ever got this bad. Okay, let's say you're walking down the street in this HOA. What are your options going to be when you get to this point, right? Option A, you maybe stumble off to the left here into the bushes. Option B, you have to walk out into traffic trying to get around this section of the sidewalk. Not only that, but keep in mind that the ADA definition of a trip hazard is a 1/4 inch rise in the concrete. So obviously quite a bit more than that. Again, I think it's just remarkable how it got to this point, but imagine if you're in a wheelchair, if you're pushing a stroller, if you're just running at dusk and you come up to this. I mean, that's a very bad accident waiting to happen. Okay, we're going to switch gears now. We'll talk about reserve studies and just speaking in general about how these documents are used by communities when they prepare their annual budgets. Okay. First, I'm going to establish the definition of a reserve study, which comes from National Reserve Study Standards. I'll pause and make a point here. Everything I'm talking about in today's class, this is industry standard type stuff. This is not unique to our company or to me. So this is by no means meant to be a sales presentation. This is just how it's done within the industry. Okay. These standards have been in place for over 20 years. Basically, they define a reserve study as a tool to document, really, but a tool that does a couple of things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And then secondly, it provides a funding plan that gives guidance about how to deal with future expenditures. Okay. Now, notice what I didn't say. Okay, a reserve study is not an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study. It's not an engineering report. It's a very particular document that contains very specific content regarding the physical and financial elements of the community. There are 3 types of reserve studies. So if a community has never had one done before, then it will begin with what's called a full reserve study. In that type, the provider is creating everything totally from scratch, right? So it involves a thorough site inspection, which means taking measurements, taking photos, gathering up all the raw data that will eventually become the component list for that property. Now, after you've had a full study done, there are 2 types of updates that could be done after the fact. The first type is called an update with site visit. And in that case, there's going to be a new site inspection taking place, but it will be using the existing component list, basically trying to identify any significant changes in life expectancies or cost estimates based on the current conditions of the property. There are some states that require these types of updates at specific intervals. Florida's not one. But generally speaking, the best practice is to have one of these done every 3 years or so. Now, the last type of study is called an update with no site visit, which is exactly what it sounds like. Still results in a whole new reserve study document, but instead of conducting a new inspection of the property, in this case, the provider will be corresponding with the board, with the property manager, basically to find out what projects have taken place or what new information has become available since the last time. right? So again, these are not required in Florida at any specific timeline, but if you wanted to compare to a state like California, for example, it's every 3 years you have to have an update with site visit. State of Virginia, I think, is every 5. There's a number of states now that have specific requirements in place. Okay, there are 2 parts to a reserve study. These are called the physical analysis and the financial analysis. The physical analysis portion of the study, this is where someone will be coming out to do that on-site visual inspection of all the common areas. Everything from the roof, the mechanical rooms, the amenities, the lobby, basically anything and everything that the association is responsible for needs to be evaluated. Obviously, this involves taking lots of measurements, lots of photos, documenting model numbers and serial numbers for equipment, basically doing whatever else it takes to gather up the raw data related to those components, which will eventually be used to determine their life expectancies and replacement costs. Okay, during this physical analysis, it's usually very worthwhile to try and meet with a representative from the property. That could be a board member, a manager, a committee member. But the idea there is to try and collaborate with the representatives of the community to gain from their insight and their experience of living or working there. You know, I tell our clients all the time, we're going to come out and maybe at most spend a couple of days on your property. If you've lived there for 10, 15, 20 years, you know, you've seen all the projects take place firsthand, you know what types of things are a concern. Bring that to the attention of whoever's doing your study, because that is very valuable information. Okay, the second part is the financial analysis. This is the portion that takes place back at the office where we kind of organize all of that raw data that came from the site inspection, and we can start to do some analysis, right? This is where we'll research particular costs or project history, and we're going to compare the information with our experience working with similar properties so that we can start to fill in some gaps and begin to draw some financial conclusions. Okay, there are 3 outcomes to a reserve study, which I'll go over one at a time. First and foremost, the reserve study will contain a component list. And the word component in this context really just means some instance where the association will spend money. So a reserve component could be a roof replacement project, a swimming pool resurfacing, lobby remodeling. But basically for each component, there are 3 key pieces of information that need to be determined. First, we need to determine the useful life of that component. And what I mean by that is its overall lifespan, or how long will it be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed or when it was most recently replaced, until that needs to be done again. The second estimate is its remaining useful life. Now, that number is going to be determined relative to a certain point in time. For example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, and as of this fiscal year, it is 3 years old. Okay, so in that case, you would say that, again, as of this fiscal year, its remaining useful life should be about 7 years. Now, lastly, we need to come up with an estimate for its replacement cost. And I've been asked over the years if the word replacement really matters here. So to be clear, you don't always have to be fully replacing something to justify it as a reserve component. We could just as easily say upgrade, remodel, modernize, repair, resurface, you know, whatever the scope of work is related to restoring that asset to its, you know, its intrinsic value. That's what we're planning for. So don't get too hung up on the word choice. Instead, again, focus on the need to spend money to keep that component providing its value to the association. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering how we determine what goes on that list, right? Now, I talked earlier about the Florida statutes and what they have to say with respect to reserve budgeting. In short, not much. So I want to give you a different approach, all right? Most professional reserve study providers will be using this 4-part test, which again comes from National Reserve Study Standards. Now, this is more of an open-ended definition, talking about what a reserve component could be. And the beauty of this 4-part test is that it can be applied to any different type of community. So instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist, we go in with our eyes open. We're looking for anything on the property that might meet this criteria. Okay, so let's talk through these 4 parts here one at a time. Okay, let's see. All right, first part is this, is that the component in question has to be the association's responsibility. right? Pretty straightforward. An example of something that might fail this part of the test would be something like the windows and doors in a condo building. I would say that at least 99% of the time, the individual unit owners are responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors. So in that case, there's no need to include those in the reserve funding plan. In the case of an HOA where the roads are maintained by the city or the county, then obviously there's no need to include any funding for road repaving. Okay. Second part of the test is that the component has to have a limited useful life. Now, in our world, we don't use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely and there's no timeline where you would expect to replace it, then it really shouldn't be considered in your reserve funding plan, right? As an example, you can think of something like the foundation or the structure of a building or the conduit inside the walls. You know, these really should last the life of the property, however long that is. And so therefore you wouldn't be actively funding for their replacement. It's more likely at that point that a developer is going to come in and knock down the building and build something new than you would ever have to replace those things. Okay, the third part of the test here is maybe the most complicated. Component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for it to be appropriate to include. The key word there is predictable. And to be more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency. Okay, so if you can't reliably predict how much money you'll spend on something or how often, then it's probably not a good idea to handle it through reserves. Okay, and let me give you an example. And this is a question that many of you asked ahead of time. Can we include our insurance deductible as part of our reserve plan? It's a really big number. We're scared that we're going to have to pay that one day. So we would like to start planning ahead and list it as a reserve component. Now, our response to this is going to be, well, if that's true, then what should the useful life be in that case? In other words, how often are you going to have to pay that deductible? And of course, nobody knows. That's the whole reason you have insurance in the first place. These expenses come along as a surprise. It's going to be the result of, a hurricane, a natural disaster, a fire. And to make some arbitrary prediction about how often those things might occur is really getting away from responsible planning. Okay, now that's not to say that we don't recommend that you have some kind of plan in place. After all, this is Florida. There will definitely be more hurricanes over the years. The problem is that we just don't know how often or how severe, and so there's really no way for us to responsibly tell a client how often they'll have to pay that insurance deductible. Okay, in this case, normally what I'll tell them is that it might be a good idea to have some kind of third account for the association. Okay, right? You have your operating account for your routine expenses, like we talked about earlier. You have your reserve account for all the components that meet this criteria. And then maybe it's a good idea to establish some kind of emergency fund, or it could be an emergency line of credit that's available to the community in the event you have to pay for that insurance deductible. Okay, again, the problem with listing it specifically as a reserve component is that you're ultimately going to be basing your funding calculations and your budget off of the timeline of expenses. And if those expenses don't fall in line with the plan, then all of the calculations are going to be thrown off. Okay, just as an example, let's say we assume a useful life of 10 years for the payment of that deductible. So that means, we're assuming we'll get a major hurricane every 10 years on the dot. But what happens if we get 3 storms in a period of 5 years and you're expecting your reserve account's going to be able to fund the cost each time? So what happens in that case is that you're actually going to be much more likely to pull some money away from your other reserve components that do have a predictable lifespan, which is then going to result in you needing special assessments to make up for those shortfalls when those projects come due. Okay, we can talk about that a little bit more at the end of the class because I know, again, a lot of people had asked about that. So the last criteria on the sheet here is whether or not the component represents a significant cost. Sometimes we use this term, a threshold cost to the community. And I showed you earlier the statutory number of $10,000, but again, keep in mind that's an arbitrary number. In our experience, for most associations, that threshold should be set much lower, okay? The advantage to doing it that way is that, yes, you will have more components listed in your reserve schedule, but that will take the pressure off of the operating budget, which would otherwise have to absorb those costs when they come along. Okay, so just think for a moment about a smaller association, and maybe they have 6 projects that cost $5,000 each. Now, technically speaking, they would be in line with the statutes if they left those out of their reserve plan, because individually they would cost less than $10,000. But let's say that all 6 projects happen to occur around the same time. Okay, well, collectively now that's a total expense of $30,000 that they would have to try to squeeze into the operating budget. And you can imagine that if cash flow is a little tight, then they might be in kind of a tough situation. But if they had listed those in the reserve plan, the reserves component list, then they would have the ability to spend reserve money on those things, and hopefully that's less disruptive to the community. Again, just the point here is that there's no one number, there's no $1 amount that will be appropriate for any and all associations. Okay, on this slide here, I've drawn this little red bracket around the top 3 components, which are the only ones specifically mentioned by the Florida statutes. Okay, now if you look down the rest of the list, you're going to see a lot of other components that we would routinely include in a reserve study. I know, again, the statute has their definition of anything over $10,000, but the problem is that in our experience, many boards, many associations just are not aware of how much things cost. So just to give you an idea, I would say that for a smaller, simpler townhome style community, maybe there's 15 or 20 components on the list. But if you're talking about a big luxury high-rise or some other complicated property, it's very easy to get up to 50, 75, even 100 components in the list. Okay, I'm going to take a pause here for a moment just because there's some questions and answers that are coming through. Again, tons of great questions here, guys. I'm going to try to get through as many as I can, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I will be able to download the list of questions and try to answer those after the fact. But for now, let's keep going here. Okay, we'll jump back into this Hall of Shame. I think this one pretty much speaks for itself. Obviously, you've got a fence here that's just kind of hanging on by a thread, probably going to get knocked down the next puff of wind, not even a hurricane here. This here is a fence around the perimeter of a pool deck, okay? Now, I took this one, I remember this. This was in a HOA community where you've got kids running around all over the place. About a 4-foot tall fence, so just the right height for kids to try to jump over. Pretty easy to imagine that ending up in a trip to the ER, okay? Not only that, this is definitely an eyesore. Think of being a realtor trying to give a tour of this property, and this is what your client sees when they get to the clubhouse and the pool area. Think about, what does that say about the property, okay? And if the fence is deteriorating this dramatically, and it's probably not very secure in the first place either, so it may not do a good job of keeping people out of the pool area, which, again, going back to that idea, if you've got kids in the community, especially little kids, keeping a secure pool area has got to be a top priority. Okay, this one's pretty interesting. This is a boiler that had apparently caught on fire at some point. Luckily, the fire must have snuffed itself out before it blew up the boiler room and took a chunk of the garage with it. The reason I included this is because clearly the association here was not doing a good job of routine inspections and preventive maintenance. In fact, we were the ones to discover this and had to kind of go back hat in hand to the property managers saying, hey, you might want to go check this out. Clearly showed they just weren't doing a good job of checking in on things. And if you're not doing the little things right, to me, it's very hard to do the big things right. Okay, last one for now. This picture here has got a bit of a backstory to go with it. This is the bathroom at a clubhouse. I will never forget the experience of walking into this building. First of all, it was padlocked from the outside. And from what I understand, pretty soon after our inspection, it had to be totally condemned, okay? I was walking the property with the board member. She was an original owner in the community. I think it was built back in the 1980s. And talking with her, getting some history about the property, she said that back in the day, their community's clubhouse was like this jewel of the neighborhood. Okay, it was this type of place where kids would have birthday parties. They got together to do big New Year's Eve bashes. I think she said they even hosted a couple weddings there at some point. Now, it was this great asset to the community and even, you could argue, to the neighborhood at large. But what happened over the years was that the residents wanted to focus on keeping the dues low and cutting from the budget wherever they could. And so that meant they essentially stopped funding reserves for the amenities. And, play that out over time. Eventually what happened, couldn't keep up with the maintenance costs for the clubhouse, and it turned into kind of a hideout for vagrants, drug users. As you can see from the photo, that's, this is what it ended up looking like. To me, that's just really sad, because we saw this complete transformation of the building from a great asset to a total liability. Eventually, they had to completely abandon it and knock it down, right? So again, when people ask why it's important to have reserves, this is one of those things that just pops right into my mind. Okay, so we're going to go back to that list of outcomes, talking about what's included in a reserve study. And this next one here is this, what we call an evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which we typically describe in terms of percent funded. Okay, actually, let me go back to that for a second here. When we talk about percent funded, we're talking about measuring risk, okay? Specifically the risk of financial distress, of special assessments, of bank loans, and that risk can fluctuate over time, okay? So just because you're at a given level of percent funded now does not mean that the community will stay there, okay? One of the best ways I've found to explain percent funded is to use this analogy of a credit score. We've all had credit reports pulled. We should know what our credit scores are to an outside party like a bank or a credit card company. Your credit score is basically an indicator of what kind of risk you are. In the same way, if you think of the reserve study like a credit report and you want to distill it down to one key result, I think that should be percent funded. Okay, so we measure it on a 0 to 100% scale. We're going to consider anything between 0 to 30% funded to be a weak position. What that means is that associations will have a higher likelihood of those problems, those special assessments, those loans, those cash flow issues. Once you get to be above 30% funded, now you're in a fair range where the risk is more moderate. Okay, it's not an emergency anymore, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. Where you really want to be is above 70% funded. That's where we've seen the lowest statistical risk of those types of problems occurring. Okay. We've talked a little bit about the concept of percent funded, but now let's talk about how you actually would calculate it, okay? The idea is pretty simple. Basically, we're just going to look at how much money an association has at some point in time, and then compare that amount against how much money it should have at the same point in time. Okay, we're going to then just express that number, that comparison, as a percentage. Okay, so the first part, pretty straightforward. How much money do you have? When we're doing a financial analysis, we're going to look at the current financial statements, and we're looking ahead to the start of the following fiscal year to try to estimate how much money will be in reserves at the beginning of that year. Okay. Now the second part, now we're going to compare that amount against how much money the community should have. Okay, and this notion, this concept of how much they should have, that is a dollar amount that we call the fully funded balance. Okay, now I want to make this clear. The fully funded balance is a theoretical number. Okay, the way I put this in perspective is I can ask you a question. So if I were to tell you that an association has $50,000 in reserves, but you don't know anything else about the community, do you really know anything at all? Is that sufficient? And I'll hear this sort of thing all the time from board members. Okay, somebody would say to me, for example, our association's in great shape. Okay, we have $900,000 in reserves. But then I've got to point out to them that, $900,000 sounds like a lot of money, but we don't really know if that's adequate unless we have something to compare it against. Okay. It all depends, of course, on what type of property we're talking about. If you're working with a little 2-story building with no amenities, just has a simple parking lot, it could be $50,000 is plenty of money for that property. But if you're dealing with a luxury high-rise building, now you know that $50,000, that can just be a drop in the bucket, right? And that can be wiped out in one installment of one project, concrete restoration, elevator mod, painting. You high-rise managers out there know 50 grand is unfortunately just not a lot of money for a building like that. Okay, let's take this take this idea one step further. Okay, I'm going to talk about how do we actually calculate the fully funded balance. Again, another simple idea. All we're doing now is looking at how old a component is compared to its overall lifespan, and we're going to get a fraction from that. We then multiply that fraction by the current estimated cost of the component, which tells us then how much money we should have today for its eventual replacement. Okay. Now, when we do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if the association has 4 components or 400. We're going to calculate the fully funded balance for each individual component and then just add all those numbers together. Now, that will tell us the fully funded balance for the whole association. Okay. Once we've done that, now we have something that we can use to examine the actual cash on hand and put that number in perspective. Okay, we're going to talk through this. All right, let's do an example. We'll pretend that we're on the board or that we're the manager of this, fictional property. We'll call the Seaview Condominiums, and our task is to calculate percent funded for this community at the start of the upcoming fiscal year. Okay, now that we've begun to understand the concept, the first thing we have to do is establish the starting reserve balance for this fiscal year. So let's say that we have reviewed the financial statements, we've taken into account any projected spending for the year, and we know how much money we're going to contribute, we're going to put into the reserve account, and let's assume that leaves us with a starting position of $60,000 going into this upcoming fiscal year. Okay. The next thing, of course, we need to do is calculate the fully funded balance for each of our components. And for the sake of this example, we're going to limit this to just 3 things, okay? First, we'll look at the roof, and let's say that the roof is 10 years old with an overall useful life of 20 years, and let's give it this replacement cost of $80,000, okay? Now, keep in mind that the fully funded balance is only the proportion of the cost that we need to have on hand today. So since the roof is halfway through its life, in theory, you only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today because you're recognizing that you have another 10 years to collect the difference. Okay, so in this case, we take 10 over 20, multiply that by $80,000, which will tell us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof as of right now is $40,000. Okay, again, it's halfway through its life, so you should have half of its costs saved up. Let's look at another example. Now we'll talk about our gym equipment, okay? Now let's assume that the equipment is 5 years old with an overall life expectancy of 15 years. And let's say the replacement cost is $30,000. Okay, so we know then that the fully funded balance for the equipment right now should be $10,000, right? Makes sense. It's only a third of the way through its life. You only need to theoretically have 1/3 of the replacement cost in the bank today. We'll do one more. Let's say that we that we painted the hallways of the building 2 years ago, and we want to do that every 8 years. Let's say our cost estimate is $100,000. We divide 2 by 8, so it's 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life expectancy. If we have a cost estimate of 100 grand, now we know that the fully funded balance for our hallway painting is $25,000. Okay? So not so bad, right? We know that the starting reserve balance is the $60,000, and now that we've calculated the individual fully funded balances for each of those 3 components, now we're able to determine percent funded for the whole community. Okay, so we take our $40,000 for the roof, our $10,000 for gym equipment, $25,000 for painting. We add those together and we get a combined fully funded balance for the whole association of 75 grand. If you take 60 over 75, we can determine this community is 80% funded, okay? All right, before we move on here, I just want to show you how we draw some financial conclusions about associations based on that level of percent funded. Okay, now what you're looking at here, this is the result of a huge internal analysis that we completed a number of years ago. What we did here was to look at a data set of thousands of associations, and we were measuring 2 variables. First, what was their percent funded level? And second, did we need to include any special assessments in their funding plan? And the results, of course, were pretty obvious, in line with what we would have expected. Basically, the closer an association is to 0% funded, the higher the chances that they will need immediate special assessments as part of their funding plan going forward. Again, that speaks to a situation where they have not been accumulating funds over the years. Their components are aging and getting closer to replacement. So a special assessment is basically a time when you have to make up for prior years when you were underfunding the reserves. Okay, a few years later, we did another internal study. This time we wanted to look at the correlation between percent funded and actual property value. Okay, so this time we looked at a large data set. This time it was a metropolitan area of Southern California. Here we selected a group of properties that were as similar as they could be in terms of size, age, amenities, and so forth. We measured the market value of the homes or the units in those buildings to see what difference it made when the associations themselves were in a better financial position. So to be specific, what we wanted to know here was what type of increase would we see when the association was in a better financial position with respect to percent funded. Again, that's our metric we use to measure this. So the first thing we did was to set a baseline defined by the communities that were in a weak position, again, between 0 to 30% funded. We then looked at what happened to property values. Again, these are for all comparable associations when a community was in a fair position, between 30 and 70% funded. So again, all else being as equal as possible, what we found was that the communities that were in a fair position were about 8% more valuable than the units in the weaker associations. Now, even more interesting, when you got to a position above 70% funded, there was an almost 13% gain in actual dollars per square foot property value over the ones that were in the weak position. So again, you can kind of intuit how that would be the case. The associations that have money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal, they're more up to date, more modern amenities, mechanical systems, better physical condition, which of course translates into being more attractive to potential buyers, right? Okay. One more trip through the Hall of Shame, pretty nasty looking swimming pool. Again, just a case where if the community can't even afford to treat the pool on a weekly basis, they certainly won't be able to afford resurfacing or in this case, even lounge chairs to go around it. Pretty bad times there. This one's a unique property. This had a huge tower in the center of the community that had different amenities on each floor. There was an auditorium, billiards room, card rooms, a lounge. Everything looked pretty much like this, just dirty, abandoned, moldy. And again, the result of a time when many years had gone by without adequate funding. This one's another interesting story too. If any of you guys have gone through concrete restoration, hopefully this doesn't trigger any nightmares, but this one's actually not a client of ours. It's the one that's not a client, but I just had to stop and take this picture because it shows exactly what happens to concrete over time if it's not being protected from the environment. You may remember a building in Miami a couple years ago where a balcony actually sheared off the side of the building. I believe that was a New Year's Eve party. It was maybe 2018 or 2019. You had 6 or 8 people standing on the balcony at the time. Fortunately, it was only on the 2nd floor, but the rebar structure that was holding it up basically disintegrated, turning to dust over time, and the balcony just collapsed, fell off the building onto a parked car beneath it. Very, very luckily, nobody was killed. I do think a couple of people went to the hospital, but you know, just think of if you're in that position, how would you like to be on the board or the manager of that community the next morning, right? You start getting calls from those people's attorneys asking what happened, and I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of those questions. Okay. So hopefully those photos have kind of done their job, scared you straight, so to speak. We'll switch back to talking about reserve studies and our third and final outcome that you would get from the study, which of course is the funding plan. If you think about the first two we talked about, we first talked about the component list, which is essentially defining what it is you're reserving for. We then talked about percent funded, which tells us where the community stands of some given point in time. But now that we know those two things, the last question to answer is, where do you go from here? So one of the first things we do when we design that funding plan is to look at the current budget and just try to see what happens if the client stays on their current track. You know, what happens over time given your future expenditures if you don't really materially change your contribution rate. If it's clear that that rate is not going to be sufficient, then obviously there will need to be some changes. Two of the other points that I make here is that the funding of reserves needs to be consistent with the timing of your overall assessments. So for example, if you have monthly dues to the association, there needs to be a monthly reserve contribution. I believe by law it has to be made within 30 days. So in other words, what you cannot do is just operate throughout the year, hoping that at the end of the year you'll have some kind of surplus in your operating budget, which you can then, you know, drop into the reserve account and say, hey, we funded reserves this year, and pat yourself on the back. It doesn't work that way. It needs to be a proactive plan. The last point to make here is that in those cases where the historical contribution rate has not been sufficient and the association's in bad financial shape, unfortunately, there might need to be an initial special assessment that is included as part of that plan. So in those cases, again, I mentioned this earlier, it's appropriate to think of that special assessment as a sort of catch-up contribution that's being made to catch up or make up for all those years of insufficient funding. Okay, there's a set of principles that come into play when you're designing that funding plan. We'll talk about these individually. We've only got a couple of slides here, and then we'll open this up to questions. But let's get through these. First and foremost, as you look to the future and you're modeling your reserve expenditures over time, at the bare minimum, the amount of money you put into reserves over that period of time needs to ensure that you have some amount of cash on hand. Okay, that's actually the bare minimum requirement, which is something we call baseline funding. We're going to talk about that in great detail in our second class next week. But obviously, if you don't have any money in reserves, you're basically guaranteed to have special assessments or loans, which is, again, one of the things we're trying to avoid in the first place. The contribution rate to reserves also needs to be stable. Okay, what that means, for example, is that you can't have these huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate over time based on arbitrary fluctuations. Okay, it's not fair, in other words, to assume that some future group of owners will be perfectly willing and able to double their reserve contribution overnight, which would make it a lot easier on the people who live there today. Okay, you're not allowed to plug in any balloon contributions. So for example, if you've got $1 million roof replacement that's scheduled to happen 10 years from now, you're not allowed to just operate with the expectation that you'll raise $950,000 in the 9th year and get by without putting away any money between now and then. Okay, you also don't take years off. So what I mean there is that if you've just spent a huge amount of money modernizing your elevators and you don't have to do that again for another 20, 25 years, that does not mean that you stop funding reserves for elevator modernization, because it's a cycle. It will happen again, and you should begin funding for the next time around as early as possible so as to spread the cost of the project over the longest period of time possible. Okay, the idea here is that the association membership should be paying for the deterioration of components over their useful lives, not just all at once, right, when something breaks and fails. The idea is that everyone then pays their fair share, and it's not just the unlucky people who happen to live in the property when the life expectancy for some component expires, right? That's just like this nasty game of musical chairs. Oops. Okay, now the last but maybe most important principle to follow when you're thinking about this reserve funding plan is that it's got to be fiscally responsible. All right, what do we mean by that? That means being realistic with respect to interest and inflation. It's not realistic to assume that you can earn 10% interest each year on your invested reserve funds. Unfortunately, we just know that reserve money can't be invested in anything very exciting. So that means you should be assuming a fairly low return on those funds. With respect to inflation, you also want to be using realistic numbers there. What we've found through historical data trends is that over a long enough period of time, the average annual inflation rate tends to be about 3%. So if you're assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now will be the same as what it cost you today, you're likely to be way off, and that funding plan is just not going to work. Okay. Second point on this slide speaks to being honest about the situation that you're in. Okay. If an association has not historically done a good job of funding reserves, it's critical to address that. Right? It's financially irresponsible to continue operating the way you always have just to try and maintain the status quo. Okay, it's not the job of the board of directors to make owners happy or to keep the dues low compared to the building next door. Speaking of the owners, your reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on. Again, you can't just assume that they'll pick up the tab for you. And lastly, this all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. Okay, we see it all the time. Prior budgets were not funding reserves or underfunding them. And now those associations have had the can kicked to them here in 2020. That's not an excuse to kick the can down the road for the next group of owners, okay? In a perfect world, all associations would have been carefully managed and guided over the years to some stable financial position, but we know in reality that's usually not the case. However, I want to be clear, that does not in any way remove the obligation from the board of directors to act responsibly and fulfill that fiduciary duty. Okay? Now, having said all that, at the end of the day, trust me, we recognize this is a challenge for most communities. If an association has been operating for many years without funding properly, there's a good chance they'll be in a financial hole that's going to be hard to climb out of. But it's very important not to put lipstick on a pig. Don't gloss over that, right? The owners in the community deserve to make an informed decision. And having a reserve study done, we think that's a good way to make that possible. They need to know that if the reserves are not funded properly, then the only logical conclusion will be special assessments and loans when those things need to get replaced. So going back to the beginning, if you remember our guy from that first couple of slides with the eyes closed, the fingers crossed, hoping for the best, I feel if I've done my job here today, you'll agree that that mindset is not a substitute for a responsible financial plan. So hope you've all learned some helpful information today that will benefit the communities that you serve. And now we're going to open it up to questions. So I'm going to go through, I'll switch my camera back on here. And I'm going to try to just run through some of the preliminary questions that were given to me ahead of time. Again, this is by no means a representation of all the questions that we got. I'm trying to focus on A, our time, and B, how much we can get through. As I go through these questions, I'm going to launch a poll here for you guys. If you wouldn't mind going through the questions on this poll, this will give you the ability to give me some feedback on the class. I would appreciate that. So that should be going live now, and I'll start going through the questions. So there's a question here from Bob. He says, can you discuss non-statutory reserves? Yeah, so in the association world, there's obviously HOAs and condos, and the term non-statutory only applies to HOAs. Basically, there's two ways that you can have statutory reserves in a HOA, and that's if they're initially provided for by the developer or if they're approved by a majority of the owners in the community. If neither of those two things has happened, then by default you would have non-statutory reserves, which means that they don't have to be voted upon by the owners. The board can collect reserves for whatever they want. They can spend the money however they want. It's more of an open-ended process. So I don't see that too often. I think most of the HOAs we work with have statutory reserves. But there's a lot of great information online about that. If there's more questions you have about that, again, feel free to send me an email. My email address is there up on the screen. Insurance deductibles, what's the best way to handle saving for this? I think we covered that in the class. The most common solution I'm seeing these days is a line of credit. Go speak to a bank and just find out what your options are. I think the important thing here is that you want to do that ahead of time. Don't wait until a hurricane's bearing down on Florida to go get in line with 5,000 other communities who all have the same idea at the same time. Do that now. Typically you can get pretty favorable rates for a credit line, and I think that's the way most communities are preparing for paying that deductible, because again, it doesn't satisfy the 4-part test that we would look at for defining it as a reserve component. Question here from Winnie. Can an association have a contingency reserve account? Similar to the insurance question, it doesn't fit that definition, that criteria of the 4 parts. A contingency is kind of a catch-all for something that you hadn't anticipated. I do think there is a place for a contingency account or amount of funding, and that would be on the operating side. Because again, to list something in reserves, you have to give it a useful life and a remaining useful life. And if you're just defining it as some contingency, well, then there's no scope of work there. There's no cost estimate we can plug in because it's just kind of an arbitrary number. Let's see. Asking whether money from reserves can be used in conjunction with paying off a loan or a lawsuit. Technically speaking, yes. If the owners in the community vote to approve reserve funding for some other, unintended purpose, that's called a non-scheduled use of reserve funds, then it is permissible by law. But that's, again, going against the intention of having reserves in the first place. If you're pulling money away from a roof project to pay for a lawsuit, you should definitely think of that as a short-term solution. You want to have a plan to pay that money back and restore the amount of funding that was originally there for the roof. Okay, so technically speaking, it can be done. Definitely get your attorney involved there and go through the proper steps. But in an emergency situation, you can borrow money from reserves for other purposes, but I would not encourage that to be your first option, I guess. Let's see. How often, I'm going to try to summarize this one. How often are condo managers and boards faced with the reality that the actual cost of a given reserves project substantially exceeds the estimates in the reserve study? And the example given here is a project in a 2018 reserve study was estimated at $450,000. Subsequently went out to bid, and the lowest bid out of 4 was $780,000. So pretty big gap there. A couple thoughts. So the reality is that a reserve study is not a perfect exercise. The longer time passes between the study and the timeline of those projects, the greater the chances that those costs won't be accurate anymore. Since this one was only from 2018, I think you'd have to look at the underlying assumptions, right? What did the reserve study assume in terms of a scope of work for that project? And is that differing from what the engineering scope of work is proposing? That's something I see quite often with something like an interior renovation. There were some good questions asked about how to spend reserve money on something like a lobby or a clubhouse renovation. And that's obviously a more subjective project. If you took a poll of 10 people and said, how much should it cost to remodel this lobby? Somebody might say $10,000, somebody might say $45,000, somebody might say $500,000. They could all be right depending on the scope of work. If you're turning a lobby from a shabby 1970s era design with shag carpeting and wood paneling into a super modern glass and steel high-tech looking lobby, yeah, that's a lot of money. Might be the right thing to do, but if your reserve study had been based on a more modest approach, then that could explain some of the difference. So that's my advice, would be to look at the underlying assumptions, talk to your reserve study provider, find out how they came up with that cost, and see if there was honestly a mistake made. But that deserves certainly some more scrutiny. There was, again, a bunch of questions about pooled reserves. We're going to have a whole nother class that talks in great deal about that next week. That's also going to be recorded. So if you're not able to make that one on the 11th, hopefully we'll be able to get through most of those questions and you'll be able to catch up on that. Okay, now I'm going to try, and by all means, if folks need to drop off the line, that's quite all right. This is still going to be recorded, so we'll post this later on. If you've got other time commitments, feel free to take off. I'm going to try and stay on for another 15 or 20 minutes and just see how many of these questions I can get through. So appreciate your patience, and again, apologies if I can't get through them all, but let's see what we can do here. Let's see. Under what circumstances may reserves be used for painting? Pretty simple question. I think they absolutely should be used for painting. Again, that's one of the 3 things for condos that is required by law that you reserve for. So if your reserves have not considered painting before, then they should definitely be there. There's no hesitation. I think in some cases there's a misunderstanding that the IRS would see painting as a maintenance project, not as a capital project, and therefore you couldn't use reserve money for it. But that's not true. Depends on the form used to file the taxes for the community. If you're using, I believe, an 1120H form, it recognizes the community as a nonprofit, and painting should very naturally be done from reserves. Good question here. Please explain what's meant by threshold funding. that we're going to cover in great detail in the next class. There's basically 3 funding objectives you can have when it comes to reserves. You have baseline funding, threshold funding, and full funding. We're going to talk about those in great detail, so if you wouldn't mind staying tuned for that one. Let's see, can maintenance items be paid by reserves, i.e. no capital goods involved? I'm not sure that one. That would depend on, I guess, what you consider to be maintenance. You know, if you're doing something like seal coating an asphalt parking lot, for example, you can absolutely fund for that through reserves. You're not actually replacing any capital item. You're doing what is essentially preventive maintenance to prolong the life of the asphalt. That can certainly be a reserve component, but it would have to be listed in the reserve schedule leading up to that. We've got some folks asking if we can email the presentation. Yes, absolutely. Send me an email if you would, wsimons@reservestudy.com, and we'll be happy to provide the slides for the class. And again, everyone's going to have the recording to go with it as well. Let's see, I guess a follow-up to the example I gave earlier, can a condo association create a reserve fund for a playground to be constructed sometime in the future once a sufficient amount of reserve funding has been accumulated? Unfortunately not. No, you can create a fund, you can call it a capital fund or a savings fund, but you can't call it a reserve fund. A reserve fund is by nature there for existing assets. So you can definitely save up money to the point where you've built your playground, but that initial fund could not be called a reserve. That would only be a after the fact that you could start reserving for its eventual replacement, and all the parts and pieces of that playground could be replaced that way. Good one here. Once you've had a reserve study done, does the board have to use it as a Bible, or can the board modify some number? Great question. So a reserve study is not a mandate. Just by virtue of having one done does not make you beholden to its recommendations or to its component list. It is strictly professional advice. So the board, when they put together the budget, can and should create its own list of components. Now they can copy and paste that from the study they've had done, but if there's any disagreement or confusion or misalignment between the values in the study and what the board thinks it should be, that remains the board's prerogative to develop its own funding plan using its own numbers. Now, I think you want to be careful there. Obviously, if you've paid somebody to do a reserve study and they're an independent, objective, professional third party, they're probably going to come up with a pretty good, reliable list. So I would say at that point, the first thing you should do is talk to the provider and maybe just try to see if you can reconcile if there's any material issues there that need to be corrected. But the short answer is no. The reserve study is not a Bible. It's not written in stone. You're free to do with that information what you please. Let's see. Would an underground drainage system be a reserve item? If so, how do we calculate useful life and predictable remaining life? That's a great question. To the first point, it could be a reserve item, but to your second question, you would have to find a way to come up with a useful life and remaining life. Obviously, it's underground, typically built of very durable, steel and concrete and metal components that are not exposed to the environment. They should have, I would say, an indefinite useful life. So most often it's not something that you would treat as a reserve component, although it could be. For example, if you've got a pattern of recurring repairs, and you're noticing, hey, every 5 years we're spending like 20 grand on repairs to catch basins and piping underground, and that's becoming significant. At the very least, maybe you should model that pattern of expenses into your future reserve plan. But it is a very difficult thing to estimate because, again, it should be indefinite and it doesn't fail in a kind of predictable manner unless you're able to look backwards and try to see some pattern of costs there. Okay, my HOA has a board voted reserve and not a member voted reserve, so I would label those as you have a non-statutory reserve. My understanding is the board can spend the reserve funds in any way they vote. Is that correct? Yes, that's the long and short of it. Is if you have a non-statutory reserve, that is up to the board to collect funds, administer funds, spend funds as they see fit. It does not have to be done with the owner's approval. Let's see, some folks asking about how much does a reserve study cost. That's not an easy answer. You can seek out a company like us and get a proposal is not difficult to do. Typically, I'll just give you some general information. I would say 90% of the work that we do, if it's a full reserve study for a client, it's going to fall somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 most of the time. And again, that would be the most exhaustive, most expensive study. After the fact, the updates would be, some fraction of that cost, depending on whether or not it's including a site visit. There certainly can be times when a study costs significantly less or significantly more. It depends on the size of the property, the location, the number of amenities, the age of the property, even what time of year it is. So, best advice there is just, go out and start getting some proposals, and that shouldn't be too difficult to find out. Let's see. Okay, let's see. What sources are used to determine useful life and replacement costs? Are useful life and replacement costs negotiable when calculating reserves needed? So the sources, and I guess I can't speak for all providers because I don't know how other companies might do this, but I think generally speaking, the way that we would go about that is kind of a hierarchy of costs or of sources. So the first and best resource we're going to use when we're estimating the life expectancy or the cost of a component is actual project history for that association, right? So if you have painted your hallways in a building 2 years ago and you spent $50,000 on that, that's a data point which we can now use to try to estimate what it might cost, 6, 7, 8 years down the road. Again, we would want to factor in inflation to try to estimate what the growing cost would be over time. But that would be kind of, the first and best choice. If you don't have actual project history for your community, the next thing we would do is look at comparable properties. Are there other buildings nearby that we've worked with where we see what they paid on a price per square foot basis, for example. And now we can use that price per square foot, look at the square footage of your building, and try to come up with an estimate that way. We also are constantly talking to vendors who do this work for a living to try to get their input on what market rates are doing, what are supply costs looking like, labor rates. It's not a perfect exercise, but that's kind of the checklist that we go through is, actual cost history, whether it's from that property or a similar one. That's going to be our best estimate as opposed to using something like, RS Means or some of these other kind of industry guidebooks. Let's see. Folks asking for the copy of the presentation, definitely just use my email address here, wsimons@reservestudy.com. Happy to reply and send those back to you. Let's see. I'm going to just try to answer a couple more. I see we still have about 199 people on the line, so thank you all for hanging in with us. Question here, can costs of a project for engineers, et cetera, be paid from the reserve line? Great question, and one that comes up a lot. So to me, when you're estimating the cost of a project, you want it to be the total out-of-pocket cost to the association. So yes, I think that should include soft costs for architects, engineers, in the case of a lobby remodel, it could be an interior designer. But anything that is kind of intrinsically tied to the greater project, I think should be part of your cost estimate. So, classic example there is concrete restoration. If you have to hire a structural engineer to do a diagnosis of your building, to come up with a scope of work, oversee a contractor, I think absolutely the cost of that engineer's time should be factored into the total cost of the project. That's definitely in your best interest to do so. Another example could be a consultant for a roof project. If you're having a moisture survey done on a roof prior to looking at its replacement, to me, that's again, part and parcel of doing the roof replacement itself. And I think that should be an appropriate spending of reserves. If you're ever uncertain, check with your attorney, check with your CPA. my light's dying on me here. But those are all, all good questions and things that maybe should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Let's see, where should reserve funds be kept? Special savings accounts, CDs, special checking, annuities. Not exactly my field. All I can say is that in general, the kind of conventional wisdom is that you can't really put the principal at risk, right? So you can't just go out and put that money in the stock market. I think legally speaking, you can, but I would think that's a very risky approach, potential breach of fiduciary duty, and not something you would want to do. So from what I see, it's CD accounts, savings funds, money market accounts, really nothing more exotic than that, unfortunately. But speak to your bank. There's lots of great association bankers out there who may have more options, but for the most part, that's what we see. Let's see, can you use the painting reserves for concrete restoration work? So that is I think a question that we'll talk about next week in the discussion of straight line versus pooled reserves. Assuming this is a straight line situation where you have something labeled as painting, I would say that, maybe not. It kind of depends on how much concrete restoration we're talking about. If it's a little bit of restoration to a couple of balconies that's being done at the same time as painting is just kind of a routine, touch up, then I would say that's a reasonable way to go about it. If you're talking about $1 million concrete restoration job that's happening before any painting is happening at all, that's a different story. So probably best to discuss that. Again, I'm not an attorney, I'm not an accountant. Those people know their stuff. I would always run those types of questions through them. But it depends. If you've got pooled reserves, now it's a different story. If you've had concrete restoration or concrete repairs built into your reserve schedule before, then you can probably feel safe in spending that money there. Let's see. Can items be removed from reserves, such as a tennis court resurface? I think the question shouldn't be can they be removed, is should they be removed? A tennis court needs to be resurfaced. And so if you're not going to have reserve money for it, your only options are going to be to pass a loan or get a special assessment going, or have some excess money in operating that year. None of those are better options to me than having a dedicated, reserve contribution going towards that. So again, you think back on the statutes, what they require. If it's a condo, you have to reserve for roofing, painting, pavement, and anything over $10,000. Resurfacing a tennis court typically costs, every bit of that and more. So by that definition, I think you'd be in conflict with the statutes if you removed it. And it's not a good idea, even if statutes would allow it. Let's see, we've got maybe time for another couple of minutes here. You guys keep asking great questions. I'm trying to run through these as best I can. Again, some of these will be better covered by the class next week. There's a question here, when will the invite for the next class be sent out? I think it already has. I think I saw one that went out yesterday that would have come from Ashley at Campbell Property Management. So maybe check back in your inbox there. If you haven't received that, shoot me an email and I'll see if we can make sure that you're on the list for that invite. Okay, let's see if there's anything else here. If an association adds a capital improvement fund to its yearly budget to pay for new amenities, since using reserve funds are not permitted to be used on said items, would residents be required to vote to use capital funds, or can a board tap into these funds without a vote? Good question. I don't know the answer to that specifically. I would check with an accountant on that, but my guess would be that if it's a capital fund, then the board would have the authority to spend that money without the approval of the owners. Really, the only time you see the approval required is specifically when it's a reserve account. And in particular, that's when you're talking about a non-scheduled use of reserve funds for something that they hadn't been originally designated for. So good question, though. I'm not totally sure the answer. That could depend on also your governing documents. Feel free to think of that as a blanket statement over all these answers, is that there's what the statutes require, but there's also what governing documents might say for your community. So you'd want to look into both of those resources to find out. Let's see. Can you use reserves from one line item to cover the additional cost of a second item in reserve? Example, can we use money from painting the pool house to pay the additional cost to replace the pool house roof? Again, probably a situation based on the question where you have straight line reserves, where you have a designated painting reserve and a designated roofing reserve. And again, we're going to talk about this in the next class, but generally speaking, to move money from one place to another, or to spend money from one account on another item for which it was not originally intended, requires the vote of the owners to approve that. If you have pooled reserves and both of those items are on the list, then it doesn't matter at all. You have one combined sum of reserve money which can be spent on any asset on the list as you see fit. So. Okay, let's see. We're getting right up to about 1:30 here. I want to give Bill Campbell a chance to chime in. Bill, if there's anything else you had to offer in closing, I think I'm running out of time here. So
great, thank you, Will. Thank you all for joining us. We had over a couple hundred people at one time. That was great information. Very, very well put together and easy to follow. Very nice, Will. We thank you.
Great,
thank you
thanks.
for taking the extra time as well, and hope we can do some more together. Again, we appreciate everybody's feedback, and anything we can do to help you all, we are here. So have a great day, and again, thank you very much, Will. Really appreciate your help.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all for joining. Again, thanks to Campbell Property Management for putting this on, and I hope to talk to as many of you as possible next Tuesday. So we'll wrap it up for today. Again, thanks.
Thank you, Will. You take care.
Take care.